theology students, New Testament students, and strays. And we welcome all.
Strays.
Glad that you all have come to join us this morning. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. John A.T. Robinson, respected New Testament scholar, now wonderful supporter of Southern Seminary.
I wouldn't say one of the pillars yet.
Yes. This is his immersion week. He has been at Southwestern and is now going to be here, and hopefully he will be the better for it. He is the Dean of Chapel at Trinity College at Cambridge University. He is a country parson, half-time, up in North Yorkshire and Yorkshire Dales. And it's our privilege to have him visiting today. He has traded slots, really, with Dr. E.P. Sanders at McMaster University in Hamilton, and has just been on a quick tour through the Southwest, and was kind enough to stop through Louisville, not knowing he would be able to meet all this auspicious crowd. Dr. Robinson has been primarily focusing on studies in the Fourth Gospel as he's preparing Bampton lectures for 84 in that area. Has some interesting ideas concerning that, and I will allow him to do some introductory remarks on the topic, and then would like to have as many questions and conversation as possible. He probably would be willing to be derailed in other areas later, but let's start on the Fourth Gospel, and then perhaps if there are other aspects of his writing that you are interested in or have questions about, we can move in those directions a bit later during this hour. We're really glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Molly, and you're very friendly indeed, and I'm delighted to be here, though I didn't expect all this apparatus, but I don't mind. Let me start from a story I've told several times this week, because I have no idea, I suppose I could check it up, who it was, but I well remember at the height of the furore after Honest to God in the summer of 1963, receiving an off-print from a Southern Baptist, who shall be anonymous because I cannot remember who he was, using me, I think in all innocence, because I think he had no clue of what was happening, as a stick with which to beat the liberals because I was so sound on the subject of the Fourth Gospel. Which indeed I am, indeed, and by those standards I'm far sounder then even now than I was even then. And in fact, my interest in the Gospel of John has gone back a very long way. And I was lecturing on it when I left Cambridge in '59. And indeed, a mark on the way, though certainly at the beginning of it, was a lecture that I gave to the Conference on the Four Gospels at Oxford in 1957, which has subsequently been reprinted in my 12 New Testament studies, called The New Look on the Fourth Gospel. That's 25 years ago. In fact, it's datable for students of English fashion by the breakthrough at that particular year from post-war austerity to all kinds of frills and fancies in women's dresses. And I thought I could also detect slightly less obvious, but just as significant, a new look on what was happening in Johannine studies. I was aware at the time that it was little more than straws in the wind, which I was detecting, but it seemed to me significant that they all seemed to be blowing the same direction. And everything that's happened since has confirmed me in my judgment. Not that that means that I represent where Johannine studies are going, let alone what the layman is always looking for is some kind of assured results of modern criticism, quote, which is perpetually doomed to be disappointed, as we all know. But that I do think that, in fact, there has been a very remarkable shift in Johannine studies over the last 30 years. Perhaps I could just sort of put a marker in that. When C.K. Barrett produced his, I think, great commentary on John, was it in 55? Anyway, around about 55 first. He represented, I thought, even then, the crown of the old look. insofar as he represented really the epitome, very well done indeed, of what I called critical orthodoxy on John, the kind of thing you will still find in almost all the textbooks and New Testament introductions. I was convinced that, in fact, I go back to Barrett constantly as far the most reliable expression, most accurate expression of that sort of position. And when he wrote in 55, he was very much in the mainstream of Johannine studies. He subsequently republished a second edition of that in 78, and I regard this as one of the two great New Testament commentaries on John in English of this generation, the other being Ray Brown's in the Anchor Bible. And that by 78, on one issue in particular, he was almost alone. He was still sticking to his guns, but well aware that he was on the defensive. And that issue being the basic question as to whether John has a literary dependence upon the Synoptists. Now, in those days, everybody accepted really the position adumbrated by Streeter and others, that John certainly was dependent on Mark, probably on Luke, and possibly on Matthew, and that really represented in every way a dependent secondary tradition of very dubious historical value, that it was far more an expression of subsequent reflection upon the Christ event and very mature reflection in the light of categories which were far removed both in space and time from the events that he was purporting to record and from Palestinian Judaism in particular. By the time Barrett did his second edition, I think on that particular issue, the burden of proof had almost totally shifted. And I remember back in 1957, in the autumn, the same year in the summer that I had given my talk at this conference, a paper by C.H. Dodd in the Cambridge Theological Society, in which he'd begun with a sentence which I can still remember. The presumption of literary dependence of John on the Synoptists no longer holds. And I think that was a percipient judgment. The presumption, in other words, you can take this for granted until proved otherwise, certainly no longer holds, and indeed Barrett now is really quite out on a limb, both in terms of English and indeed American and indeed I think German New Testament scholarship. And this is a remarkable shift in the course of a single generation. This doesn't mean there aren't plenty of fluctuations on this front and counterattacks as in every other area of scholarship. And this doesn't mean the issue is settled once and for all, but the much greater degree of probability, time and again, that John represents an independent stream of oral tradition, rather than that he has simply derived his material from a conglomeration of putting the synoptics together by scissors and paste method. That, I think, has been accepted by most New Testament scholars now, and I think the I's were dotted and the T's crossed by Dodd's own subsequent, I think, very great book, Historical Tradition, the Fourth Gospel, which was written in his 80th year, and certainly in my mind has brought very clear the conviction that there is a great deal of very early material in John which has got to be taken extremely seriously, both on the history and on the geography, and indeed in the knowledge of the political and social conditions of Palestinian Judaism prior to 70. And that at least opens up the possibility that John need not be nearly so late nor so Hellenistic as we'd previously supposed. And of course, one of the major factors contributing to this, though not the sufficient cause, was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the realization that so much, particularly in the field of Johannine dualism, which we had previously thought was Hellenistic and Gnostic and the rest of it, is much more closely related to the kind of light-darkness symbolism and dualism that you get at Qumran. And so the general realization that John need not be nearly so late. But that and could be, in principle, as near to source as any of the others if he simply wasn't last in the line. Well, I've been pursuing that conviction more and more and got firmly convinced now that not only need not John be nearly so remote, but that he wasn't. And that I became persuaded increasingly that there was no need to date John anything like as late as the 90s of the first century, where he is now put almost unanimously by conservatives and radicals alike. And indeed the grounds for putting him in that decade are extremely weak. Anyway, I became convinced that one needed to shift this, the dating of John, but that obviously one cannot just take out one piece in the interlocking jigsaw of the whole development of New Testament literature, which has so many other interconnections, not only with the other four Gospels, and what is the relation between John's Gospel and the others in the time they were coming into being, but implicitly also through Luke with the Acts of the Apostles and with the Johannine epistles, and indeed more remotely with the book of Revelation. Not that I think they're by the same person, but nevertheless, Revelation is clearly presupposing Christianity in the Johannine idiom. And so this really drove me to the exercise in which I had no intention of being launched, of redating the entire New Testament. And so I produced this book with that date, with that title, in which I tried to, was driven really to the conclusion, which frankly I never expected to be driven to, that the whole of the New Testament was written before 70, and that in fact all the Gospels were coming into being over much the same time, roughly between the years of 30 and 65, and that John may well have been one of the earliest Gospels in its earliest forms and shapes to have been committed to writing, and very likely the last to be finished. And indeed the epilogue seems to me to reflect the recent death of Peter by crucifixion in the year 65, and that I would say is the sort of terminus ad quem really of the Johannine literature, because I think I would long believe the prologue was added subsequent to the epistles, and both the epilogue and the prologue reflect, in fact, the first preliminary sketch of the prologue seems to me to be visible in the opening verses of 1 John, which is then much more fully orchestrated, and that the Johannine epistles in turn presuppose an earlier preaching and indeed presentation, almost certainly writing of the gospel, and that quite a considerable time has elapsed between the two, in which all kinds of heresy and schism has arisen, which he has got very forcibly to come back on. And when I say he, precisely whether it's exactly the same pen that produced it all, I'm inclined to think it is, over a period, because I think the purely literary stylistic differences are simply not enough to demand a different hand, though the line between the I and the we in the Johannine community is so thin that frankly I don't think this makes much difference. But I'm inclined to think that now that the gospel material was first committed to writing in its present form in the early 50s or mid-50s, the epistles come in the early 60s, and the epilogue and prologue probably in about 65 plus. But that this in turn, by the very internal evidence of the gospel itself, goes back to not merely the beginning, as the Johannine epistles calls it, of when they first heard the gospel, when this community first received it, but to the beginning in which the gospel itself was rooted, and to not only the time but also in place, to the heart of Palestinian Judaism, I think, in Jerusalem itself. In the period, I would say, between the crucifixion and the Council of Jerusalem, where, after all, Paul met John at the Council of Jerusalem, already engaged upon mission to the circumcision. And I think I've always have thought that John is primarily written for the Jewish mission, I think in its present form for the Jewish Greek diaspora mission, for the other sheep who must be brought in, the scattered children of God, who I don't think are Gentiles, but as in the whole Old Testament background, the diaspora. But that the hard core of the Johannine tradition was in fact shaped in the kind of dialogue and bitter disputation with, quote, the Jews, who I think are primarily the Judeans, the hardcore of the Jewish establishment in Jerusalem, with whom, it seems to me, the Johannine community was in dialogue, I would say, in the very heart of the city itself, because although there's evidence, obviously, of Johannine missionary community activity both in Samaria and indeed a greater interest in Galilee as well, the thrust and the weight of the Johannine material is clearly centered in the dialogue with the Jews of Jerusalem. And I think that one can be a good deal more specific than that. And I think figures like Nicodemus and so on are crucial to the whole understanding of the sort of mission upon which the Johannine Circle was engaged, which is primarily with the heart of the Jewish establishment and those who were rejected by it, which had strong connections both with the top people like Nicodemus and with the high priestly circle. And indeed, I suspect from the beginning was almost certainly with the Hellenists, with the Greek-speaking Jews. And one of the things that's come clearer to us more and more over the last generation is the enormous amount of Greek that was spoken at all levels in Palestine, particularly in Galilee and particularly in Jerusalem. And I think on purely linguistic grounds, there is, in my mind now, no reason at all why the kind of Greek which you get in John, which as every student of New Testament Greek knows, is the easiest Greek in the New Testament. It is very flat, simple, idiomatic syntax and vocabulary, which has no solecisms but many Semitisms, is written by a man, I think, who's probably his first language was clearly Aramaic, but who was probably perfectly able to communicate in Greek at a fairly limited level, probably from childhood onwards. And indeed had been not unlike the third-year Greek student here, had actually learned it from a child. In a bilingual situation, you simply could get nowhere in Galilee without Greek. It was the lingua franca. And if you wanted to write classic Greek like Josephus, you had to go to school, as he tells us, and he was very proud that there were no Semitisms in his Greek at all, which is actually true. And he really had gone through a sort of liberal education in classical Attic Greek. Well, John certainly didn't do that, but I suspect they probably started in much the same milieu. And I have become increasingly convinced that there's no real final objection to John the Apostle being the author of this book, and indeed I think he goes as near back to source as any other. And I am at the moment working on, with very strong connections with the high priestly household, probably below stairs rather than above, and with knowing a great deal of the topography and the social conditions of a Palestinian Judaism which was to disappear off the face of the earth in the year 70. And indeed, 18 months ago, I was going round in in Palestine again, simply investigating Johannine sites. And I am more and more persuaded. I've only looked at a book in your library this morning, which is the first library, I may say, in this great continent. I found a copy of it, so that's a great bonus for Southern. But written by a man who I met for the first time in Jerusalem, but I last was on sabbatical when I was there the second time. I'd like to have pumped him at all sorts of points. A Lutheran, Bruce Shine, who lives at the Lutheran Church in Jerusalem and takes American students round. Whoever had a chance of being taken round Palestine by him, I warn you, you'd have to do it on foot. You had to foot slog everything, but he's followed the itinerary as Jesus. And indeed, this book is called Following the Way. And he really has convinced himself that whoever wrote this gospel knew the thing like the back of his hand. And equally, I am quite independently, actually, we have both come to exactly the same chronology of the ministry. because I become more and more convinced that if you allow the Johannine evidence at least a procedural priority, I'm not saying it's the first gospel, but I think it's a first gospel, and if instead of doing what we usually do, simply read John in the light of the synoptists and regard the synoptists as giving us for instance, on the chronology of the ministry, the outline into which John has somehow to be fitted. If one proceeds the other way round, then I find that in fact you can really understand the synopsis time again by the material that John gives us in a way that they are not often self-explanatory. And in terms of the chronology, we have both quite independently come to the conclusion that Jesus had a 2-year public ministry with 3 Passovers, one at each end, which John chronicles almost month by month, and into which the synoptists can be fitted, but not the other way around. And that also, I think, thanks to John alone, one can get an absolute dating of this from April 28 to April 30. The only 2 points in which John fundamentally disagrees with the synoptic chronology, namely on the cleansing of the temple and the date of the crucifixion. I think in both cases John is right, and that John dates both very specifically. We can get from calendrical evidence precisely what year the Passover did fall on a Friday, and that I don't think the synoptists can be right on that evidence. And also at the very beginning, the whole reference to the 46 years this temple's been in building, I think is a very precise chronological thing which fits an early cleansing of the temple but not a late one. And so one could go on, and I've gone through the whole story of Jesus and in some great detail, and indeed subsequent to the teaching of the person of Jesus, on what happens if you allow this kind of procedural priority to John. And I think it is in fact a very well-based exercise, because I think the reasons for thinking that it does go back both in time, space and person to the Alpha, as well as being in almost all regards also the Omega of the New Testament witness, one of the most profound and mature statements and re-evaluations of the Christ event from the end in the Spirit, that he is primarily a witness to the Christ of faith, no one would dream of denying, but that the Christ of faith includes the Jesus of history, and that the one who primarily has the theology of the Word made flesh takes the flesh as seriously as the Word, and that I think he is a primary witness, and he is, of all the New Testament witnesses, the only one to have written both a gospel and an epistle, and he well knows the difference in perspective between the two. Anyway, this I find a most exciting and fulfilling exercise, which I am currently engaged on, as Molly said, for the Bampton Lectures in '84. And that, just to end with an analogy, which, because people say, well, this sounds quite absurd. How could this be written so near the events? Well, first, within the, by comparison with the other Christian literature, if one says, because most people start, of course, in the prologue, which I think is the latest, probably, one of the latest stream in the Johannine literature, and I don't think is particularly philosophical or Alexandrian or any of the other things we used to think about, that this is basically an elaboration of the Jewish wisdom tradition, as Ray Brown and others, I think, have shown very well. It is clearly written for a Hellenistic Jewish situation in Asia Minor, and I think is using the Logos terminologies, which was probably as much in the air as evolution was in the air in the 19th century, or relativity was in the air in the 20th century, and doesn't demand great philosophical sophistication to translate the significance of Jesus into that kind of language. But it's very parallel. The nearest parallels are, of course, the kind of language Paul uses in Colossians, if you believe Colossians by Paul, as I firmly do, and where the author to the Hebrews at the beginning is using this pre-existence Christology, and that those are the nearest parallels. Now, I think that Hebrews was written probably in about 67, and I would put Colossians back to about 58, but at any rate the early 60s. Well, and indeed in exactly the same areas traditionally the Gospel of John has come from, the Ephesus area, that I think that kind of Gnosticizing Jewish Christian thinking was very rife in Asia Minor at that time, and the letters of certain churches and the pastoral epistles and others show evidence of it, and that I think that fits the sort of milieu of the world in which, if you like, the silver age of the apostolic period was fighting both heresy and schism and later persecution. There's no evidence of persecution in the Johannine epistles. But that if you look not with the internal comparisons of the Christian literature, but just take one analogy which has often been used before, and which Dodd used but never drew the conclusions that I would draw from it. If you ask, as I sometimes set an essay to, if I get a bright classicist coming over to theology, which is a rare event these days, I sometimes set an essay on compare and contrast the materials for the historical Jesus and the materials for the historical Socrates. Now this is quite an interesting comparison, because the materials of the historical Socrates are basically, apart from things on the side, Xenophon's Memorabilia and Plato's Dialogues. And they correspond very interestingly to the difference between the Synoptists and the Fourth Gospel. Xenophon's Memorabilia are a series of isolated incidents, stories, sayings of the great man, the sort of thing you get in the Markan tradition. The Plato's Dialogues are, of course, much more like what one gets in John, where the whole thing has been put through the mill of Plato's own thinking and vocabulary, just as in the Fourth Gospel everything's been put through the mill of John's own categories and vocabulary, so it's impossible to tell where Jesus is speaking, where the evangelist is speaking. And to that extent is further removed from the ipsissima verba. But nevertheless, I think almost everybody would agree that Plato was the man who got nearest to the heart of Socrates, who indeed knew him much more intimately. He was a younger, intimate disciple of Socrates in a way that Xenophon had never been. And I think the other thing is, which people don't realize, is that the time gap is very much shorter than one would ever imagine from the sort of thing that people assume is necessary for development in New Testament study and literature. That the apology of Socrates, of Plato, which is Socrates' defense at his trial, and corresponds in many interesting details to the trial narrative of the Fourth Gospel. This is really a straight sort of presentation of the case of what Socrates really stood for. Now that was written within 2 or 3 years of Socrates' death in 399, as far as one can tell. And indeed, I think almost all trial literature starts, whatever the subsequent development may be, starts very near to the event indeed. Of course, the process is speeded up in our days of instant printing and publication. But, I mean, if you look at current trial narratives, the trial of Steve Biko, the trial of Bears No Deer, the trial even of Lady Chatterley, in which I was involved, all these things come off the press by the people who are interested in the person or the cause, as it were, as a piece of apologetic for it, very rapidly. You don't wait 2 generations before you use this very important material in your presentation of the truth as you see it, and what the person concerned was really stood for. And in fact, the trial narrative of the Fourth Gospel, I think, is one of the straightest pieces of reporting. Obviously, it's rewritten. No one is saying that this is ipsissima verba. It's interpreted throughout, like all the other trial narratives are. But that I think if you want to get as close both to the events and to the interpretation of it, I would go to the trial narrative in John sort of as a primary source. And if you take another analogy from the Platonic literature, the Phaedo is an account of the great man's last night with his disciples talking about immortality. Again, it is all done through the medium, as it were, of Plato's philosophy. But nevertheless, it obviously has strong roots with the historical base there and of Socrates' most intimate self-understanding. And I think this corresponds very closely to the last discourse in the fourth Gospel. Now, as far as one can date the Phaedo, it is within 20 to 25 years of the death of Socrates. Now, I see no good reason to think that development of the material in the last discourses or the fourth Gospel requires any greater distance, and that I think that one is probably as close to source, reinterpreted and reevaluated and seen, as it were, in the spirit from the end as to what Jesus was really about than anywhere else in the New Testament witness. And so I've long believed that he's both the Alpha and the Omega, and I find this actually a very rich vein for tapping for the understanding not only of the story but also of the teaching, which of course again has gone through the sort of transposition into another key, but nevertheless I think is a very deeply faithful rendering of what Jesus really meant, and indeed the reflection upon his person. And I don't think John is way out on his own. In fact, the only bit of my material to so far been published is a thing in the current number, at least it may not any longer be the current number, of Theology, where I've involved in a dialogue with Maurice Wiles and James Dunn over Dunn's latest book, Christology in the Making. And this was written, in fact, this last year for the New Testament Seminar at Cambridge when Dunn's book was being taken as our subject. And I am convinced that he's tried to make John the sort of odd man out in New Testament Christology, whereas I think what he's doing at this, as at so many other points, is really drawing out what was really there all the time. And that a phrase that I constantly recur to, which William Temple used to call the profoundest, forgotten the exact words, interpretation of John that exists in the English language, Browning's Death in a Desert, where John is made to say, what first were guessed as points, I now knew stars. In other words, he's really drawing out what was in the history rather than simply creating the history, that he's deeply symbolic at every level, he's deeply theological, but I become more and more convinced that he's most historical when he's most theological and vice versa.
Dr. Robinson, is there how would you define Palestinian Judaism vis-a-vis Hellenistic Judaism? Are you using Palestinian Judaism in a broad range, or is there a clearly definable Palestinian Judaism vis-a-vis what we would call or have called Hellenistic Judaism?
Well, I think this is one of another great revolutions the last 25 years, is the line between those two, which was so confidently drawn. The Palestinian Judaism, of course, was with Hebrew, Aramaic speaking, Hellenistic Judaism was Greek speaking, and there was a firm line between the two as to what they read and what their literature consisted of, etc. This is more and more being eroded. It's an extremely fuzzy line. If you look at Hengel's great study, Hellenism and Judaism, you will see one of the sections in that is called something like Palestinian Judaism as part of Hellenistic Judaism. And in fact, it had all, from the time of Alexander the Great onwards, been so Hellenized that the line between the two is surely a matter of emphasis. Of course, there were areas where Aramaic was the primary language in a way it wouldn't have been in the diaspora. But nevertheless, that I think most people, except in the remotest villages, all the coins were in Greek, everything was in Greek. And do you know that book, Do You Know Greek, which is a quotation actually from the Acts of the Apostles, and is a study by Svenster, the Dutch scholar, on how much Greek was spoken in Palestine in the 1st century and at what level. And the answer is an enormous amount at every level. He actually uses the Epistle of James as a test case. Could this have been written by James the Lord's brother? Now, the Epistle of James is far more sophisticated Greek than the fourth Gospel. And his answer was, yes, indeed it could. Whether it was, another matter. But on the purely linguistic ground, there's no reason why the brothers of Jesus, or indeed Jesus himself, or the early apostles, did not, and indeed could not, have spoken Greek. There's no reference to an interpreter anywhere in the Gospels. And indeed, the trial of Jesus would undoubtedly have taken place in Greek before Pilate. I think that if there was such a conversation as John 3 represents between Jesus and Nicodemus, that it almost certainly did take place in Greek, where particularly the upper echelons, the top people, probably preferred to speak Greek, the language of the civilized world, as well as, of course, of Hebrew and Aramaic at the same time. But the whole of that dialogue turns on the pun between being born again and being born from above. And that pun only works in the Greek anothen. Now, that doesn't mean to say that this was necessarily a system of verbal original conversation, but it certainly means, I think, the Johannine community was dealing with a Greek-speaking situation. I think the reasons for thinking that it was a translated gospel are very thin indeed, that it's certainly full of Semitisms, because I think that's the kind of accent with which John wrote Greek. And indeed his community, I suspect, was with what the Acts of the Apostles calls the Hellenists. And I think the Greeks who tried to see Jesus in John are almost certainly, in my judgment, Greek-speaking Jews who've come up to worship at the feast. They aren't Gentiles. And will he go to the dispersion among the Greeks in chapter 7? This is one of the many ironies of the fourth gospel. Of course Jesus is not going to the dispersion among the Greeks, but that is precisely where the gospel is going and for which it's intended. And I think that is the milieu, and I've long since, long before I got onto this early dating business, thought that that was the destination of the fourth gospel. In fact, it's in my 12 New Testament studies 20 years ago.
Would you address the issue of John's Christology in relation to the synoptics? You've addressed the authenticity of geography and time and the portrait of Jesus. And yet, we still seem to have a very differing account of who they understand Jesus to be. Would you address that in light of what you've developed?
Well, I think, again, basically what John is drawing out is what is already implicit in the synoptics. I mean, if you take that very early, assuming some kind of Q hypothesis of that saying in the Synoptic Gospels, no one knows the Father except the Son, and whoever the Son reveals him to etc. Now, that is almost pure Johannine language, except, of course, the word reveal, which is very interesting, doesn't occur in John, despite the fact that Bultmann calls him the revealer throughout. And indeed, the words that don't occur in John seem to be very significant, and they're all the technical terms which were later used by the Gnostics. Gnosis doesn't occur in John. Sophia, wisdom, doesn't occur in John. Even pistis doesn't occur in John, which is a remarkable phenomenon. All the verbs do, but that neither actually the verb apocalyptine nor the word apocalypsis ever occur in John. The word pleroma, fullness, doesn't occur in any technical sense. All the things that Paul took up and used and turned against his opponents, John somehow seems to be avoiding because he's so near and yet so far. But just to go back to the question of this pericope from Luke and Matthew, I think that is a window into the sort of self-understanding of Jesus, which takes us to the heart of the relationship to God as Abba, Father. And if there is, as Jeremias has shown, if there is any absissima verba of Jesus, which with confidence we can say actually use these words in the Aramaic, it is Abba and Amen, in a very distinctive way, which is reflected again in John at the beginning of his teaching, Amen, Amen, I say to you. But I think this Abba relationship of the Son to the Father, which I think is the very heart of what at the center was going on in Jesus' whole self-understanding of himself and his mission. That is drawn out, of course, enormously and deepened and expanded in John, but I don't think it's a new thing. And all the language about pre-existence and the rest of it, is really trying to look at this in depth and to draw out the what it means for Jesus to be the unique way to the Father, the unique revelation of the Father, the uniquely obedient Son. In fact, the uniquely normal man, because there's no doubt that, it's very interesting in concordance, the word man, anthropos, and ania is used of Jesus more times in John than in all the other Gospels put together. And the idea that he wasn't genuinely a man, that he was merely a sort of docetic type of sort of Gnostic redeemer who came down the path of parabola and just sort of were about 6 inches above the ground and then went back whence he came. I mean, that is the sort of thing that he's attacking bitterly in the Johannine epistles. If you don't really mean that Jesus come in the flesh, then this is very antichrist. And I think this idea of reading back a sort of Gnostic redeemer or a sort of Nicene Christology of a heavenly person who becomes a man. I've worked this out a bit in that very short article on theology, but I believe that John is, in fact, is fully in line with the other gospel tradition, drawing it out at all sorts of points, but not fundamentally producing a different sort of Christology.
Would you say, even at the point of Thomas' confession, that's drawing out of synoptic?
Yes, I think that this is a highly existential confession of someone who is saying that, I mean, just as earlier in the Gospel, he who has seen me has seen the Father, there is an equivalence, not an identity between Jesus and the Father. In fact, although they are totally at one, the subordination of the Son to the Father, of the one who is sent, is nowhere more strongly brought out in John. But that when you've seen him, you've seen the Father, and therefore to say, my Lord and my God, is a way of expressing this, that in this man you see, and you need look no further, because you have seen God to be at work in his person and his deeds. So someone had a question over there.
Yes. As you well know, in Ian Sherwin White's book on Roman society and Roman law in the New Testament, after his analysis of the legal implications of the trial in light of Roman custom, he more or less takes to task New Testament scholars for their skepticism regarding their documents. I wonder what your reaction to his assessment is.
Well, I almost totally agree with him. I mean, I'm not a Roman historian, let alone a Roman lawyer, and therefore I can't check him up in detail, but I think he's shown time and again, both particularly with regard to Acts and also with the Gospels, and not least the fourth Gospel, that the evidence of the Gospel of the New Testament is extremely good evidence for Roman society and Roman law, and indeed is often our only evidence and primary evidence, because the rabbinic evidence is 2 centuries later and cannot be regarded as primary evidence at all. And you can never, I think, start from the Mishnah and say the Gospels are unhistorical because they represent the trial. I think there are points in which I've gone into great detail with the aid of the Mishnah to show that I think John is actually right on the trial as opposed to the synoptists at points, but that I think Sherwin White is entirely right, and he's a very good Oxford historian with a very good reputation among historians there, classical historians. And I think that time and again he's saying, you chaps have no idea what good sources you've got. And I think this is very relevant, say, to the dating of Acts, because he makes the point, he doesn't date Acts, but he says there's no evidence for any changes in Roman procedure and administration after the 60s reflected in Acts. Well, this bears out very much my conviction that Acts was written just about where it ends, in about 62, and it ends where it ends because that's where things had got to at the time of writing. Therefore you've got to put Luke before that and so on. And I think Sherwin White is very important evidence. And I would like to go in, really take it a great deal further if I was competent. And I think it is a great tragedy that New Testament scholars now are not classicists. They don't read the classical writings. Equally, the classes don't read our writings. The Journal of Theological Studies was started in 1900 only because the Journal of Hellenistic Studies was getting so gummed up with articles that it wouldn't any longer take articles from New Testament scholars. Previously, they always had a single journal. They read each other's works. But of course, the division has gone further and further away now and will never return, I fear, because most of us, I happen to be grounded in classics, so I've forgotten most of it, but we just haven't got the depth of education that the sort of people like Lightfoot had. I mean, never again will you get a massive scholar who was equally at home in sort of the patristic area, the New Testament area, the classical area, or indeed as my uncle Armitage Robinson. I mean, they knew their stuff at a depth and level we will never know. I take them very seriously indeed. And incidentally, J.B. Lightfoot, whom no one quotes on John at all, they all think of Westcott as the one of the trio who wrote on John, which indeed is true. But look at his biblical essays. The first 200 pages of that, published posthumously, were material of Lightfoot's on John, which I still think is a good deal sharper than anything Westcott ever did. And one of the tragedies was that when Westcott came back to Cambridge as Regius Professor in 1870, he handed over John to, Lightfoot handed over John to Westcott and never lectured on it anymore. I wish he had, because I think there's some superb material in there.
Let me shift the trend of questions for a moment. One of your writings that has been of most interest to me is Your Truth is Two-Eyed, and several of us in the theology department have read that. Would you share with this group, perhaps those who've not read it, how you construct the idea of the uniqueness of Christ vis-a-vis religious pluralism?
Golly, you are asking the big question, aren't you? Actually, just as it was to make the connection between the other, it was Westcott was always convinced, in fact, that the great commentary on John yet remained to be written by an Indian. And I think that perhaps that's true. I frankly don't see any signs of this happening at the moment, because I think we are all far too one-eyed in our religious traditions. And I was asked to give these lectures in India, for which I was totally unqualified, because comparative religion had never been part of my very one-eyed education as a student. And so I was greatly stretched to have to read up a lot. I was fascinating, and I knew I couldn't duck this invitation. You know, I funked going to India very much. But I really tried to do some homework on this, and went through India for 2 months and Sri Lanka, and tried to enter into as much dialogue as possible. And I became more and more persuaded that it was vitally necessary that we should get away from the sort of monocular vision that most of us have in purely sort of Western categories. The two eyes that I was particularly talking about, and I was asked to lecture on the frontiers in Christianity and Hinduism, though in many ways it would be more interesting for me to lecture on Christianity and Buddhism. But nevertheless, the two eyes were not Christian eyes and Hindu eyes, but much more a way of thinking from the West, for which I gave the paradigm of Martin Buber's I and Thou in the Hebraic tradition, which I did my own PhD. I wasn't in the New Testament field at all. But basically that in the beginning and in the end is relation between I and Thou. Contrasted, say, with the presupposition that lies behind all Eastern thinking. Tattvam Asi, Thou art that. In other words, an identity between the Atman and the Brahman, and the abolition of relationship, finally, in absorption. And that this was nirvana, this was truth. Now, I think either of those pressed to extremes in isolation gives a very distorted and dangerously false worldview by itself, though I personally, being a Westerner, think is where there's more truth on one side than the other. But that I do think one's got to hold these together, as the mystical traditions of both our religions all over the world have always attempted to do. and that we've got to marry East and West. In fact, there's a new book by Bede Griffiths called The Marriage of East and West, which I would very much recommend from this point of view. He's a Benedictine monk who's lived in South India for most of his life and can speak with an authority which a mere visitor like me can never do. But he and I are very close, and indeed he's been very gracious about my writings. He's just sent me a copy of this. But I think from this point of view, we've got to recognize how blinkered and one-eyed we are, and that we have got to see that the truth is many-faceted and many-eyed, and that we have closed far too easily for an understanding of the uniqueness and finality of Christ, which I should firmly want to uphold in terms of a purely exclusivist view, which I think is just untrue, say to the prologue of the fourth gospel. If the light is focused in this man, it is the light and life that, behind everything in all creation and all history, and that there are many faces of God, some far more adequate than others, but from which we can learn, and that we have been, our God is too small, our Christ has been too small, and that we've got, that the Christ is a much bigger category. After all, it's originally a Jewish category, it wasn't even a Christian category at all. And we've identified it just as the Buddha got identified with one historical individual. It's really a title, the enlightened one. So I think the Christ is bigger than Jesus, though I think Jesus is the clue to the Christ, just as I think God is bigger than Christ, though the Christ is the clue to the sort of human face of God. But that I would argue for a much bigger understanding. He's been talking about my panentheism, which of course everybody thinks sounds like pantheism, which is very different. But I think that I would want a very much broader based understanding of God than simply as we're starting off from one face of him. And I think that if we are to restate the central truth of the Christian claim, that in Jesus we do find the Word made flesh, and I firmly believe in the incarnational theology, but that we've got to have it much more in inclusivist terms and exclusivist terms, and that we've got to have a strong center but very open edges instead of very hard edges, and never mind how soft the center is.
What about the quarrel over the filioque?
Oh, word, you are. Well, this is an area of church history in which I don't pretend to be an expert. I should have thought, like so many of these quarrels, it is really a quarrel about words, which undoubtedly greater issues, mainly of a non-theological kind, were involved in the split between East and West. And frankly, I mean, I honestly don't think it makes much difference whether you say it's through the Son or the Spirit comes through the Son or not. And indeed, certainly our own communion, the Anglican communion, has said, and the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, who is actually very strong in relations to the Orthodox, I mean, he's been one of the people who've said, well, gladly let's revise the creed if it'll make the Orthodox happy at this point. And, frankly, I mean, nothing of fundamental truth is involved, and that it depends, of course, which texts you fix on, particularly from the fourth gospel, used in a totally uncritical, uncontextual manner, as indeed the early fathers did, whether they were on the Orthodox side or the Arian side. They could all draw on the fourth gospel for whatever they wanted. And you can use the Bible as a quarry for almost anything you wish to find in it, if you are sufficiently selective, as indeed you can obviously produce purely exclusivist texts, not least from the fourth gospel. But I think this is a profound misunderstanding of what John is really trying to do. And so, I mean, I wouldn't lose any sleep over this at all. And if this is the only thing that is dividing East and West Christendom, well, we could settle it in an afternoon, I should have thought. But of course it isn't the only thing. We've grown apart in all sorts of, we've grown hard edges in all kinds of other ways. And this is one of the tragedies of splits within the churches, that We've all become, in a way, little Catholicisms. We've all become systems in our own right with our own sort of systems of order and doctrine, and we negotiate across these hard frontiers like Reagan and the Russians. And I mean, if you go on like that, I mean, it'll get no more results than you do at these conferences that they all sit down at. But I think that we've got to undercut a lot of these things. And to me, one of the most inspiring moments this last year, and there haven't been many inspiring moments this last year, was that when Pope Paul met with the Archbishop of Canterbury in Canterbury Cathedral, and they both prayed and knelt together and had, signed a declaration which, if it is really meant seriously, could be a major breakthrough. Now, I think the Pope is a very conservative man, and frankly, I don't think much is going to happen in a final breakthrough under his pontificate. But nevertheless, I think the spirit is there, and the spirit is very willing on both sides, and I think this is enormous. The atmosphere has totally changed, and this is what I think makes the difference. And the atmosphere has changed in the New Testament study, and of course in Roman Catholic participation in biblical studies. And that the more this is also going to happen on the other side, that the sort of conservative groups are coming out from their lager and really joining the rest of us in using basically the same critical methods with some better presuppositions and often better work than I think some of the sort of current regnant dominant position of American New Testament scholarship. I dissociate myself from a great deal of the direction in which it's going, frankly. I think it's gone a-whoring after redaction, criticism, all the rest, in a way that I think has become quite unbalanced. And so the Gospels end up by telling us an enormous amount about the church and the Johannine community, but almost correspondingly nothing about Jesus, which I think is just a false either-or. I think can tell them a great deal about both, according to which questions one asks. And the fourth Gospel in particular is a rich mine for telling us a great deal about the Johannine community. Though I don't buy the particular setting in life in which this is usually set in the late after 85, because I don't believe it belongs there, and these reconstructions are extraordinarily subjective in my judgment. But I do think one can use it as telling us a great deal about the Johannine mission. But equally, I think it tells us a vast amount about the Jesus of history.